So Skype interview, David Ernst, Liquid Democracy. I'm not going to say much more about those things. You're going to find out throughout the actual conversation. But what made us reach out to him is because this is not just about the vision, and he's actually taking the right steps to implement it. And that is what I'm trying to understand more about the space. It's not just about ideas, but it's more about the strategy or the tactic you use to get to that idea or that vision that you want to achieve. And that's what makes it really interesting to talk to this guy. So enjoy. I am super excited to be talking to you about basically what you're trying to do. And I think I really like the way you termed it, Democracy 3.0. And I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, especially for me as a philosophy student. When I looked at a couple of the talks before, it was things about Hegel and dialectics and where it's coming from. It got me really excited about this whole conversation. But before we dive into any of that, I want to kind of see what background you're coming from. I'm expecting from the smile on your face that you have a philosophy background as well.
That's right.
So tell me, what's your story?
Yeah, so I'll go in reverse. So most immediately, I've been working in the tech industry in Silicon Valley, in various startups that I joined that were already a little further along, and a few that I started myself, and all different industries and all different applications. In general, I'm really into this idea of creating ways for many more people to participate and allowing many more people to access an activity that was previously harder for, more siloed. Before that, I was in college studying philosophy and math. I did a math and philosophy double concentration.
Those almost always seem to go hand in hand with each other, philosophy and mathematical thinking, I would say.
Well, it comes from a line in Plato's Republic, actually. He says, it's not good to teach philosophy to younger people before they're 25 or so, because when you're younger, you're kind of not as ethical. And so you'll use the rhetorical devices that you learn to trick people, and you'll be able to convince anyone of anything. And so you should spend your first 25 years studying geometry, which is what he meant by math. And it will help you develop the abstract thinking skills and then study philosophy after that.
Yeah, because I think Plato almost bet on the fact that if you get the logical thinking, then you'll all end up with the same answer. So you don't have to worry about anything, right? And there's no trickery happening there. So you were a philosophy student, and then you went into tech. How did that happen? Like, that was just...
Well, again, stepping backwards more. So before college, I've always been really interested in tech. I first probably wrote a program when I was probably 9 or 10 years old. My main entry path was, again, combining the math and everything, was a TI-83 calculator, the programmable TI calculators. We had a fantastic math teacher when I was in middle school, and he had this rule that we could use programs on any of our quizzes and tests as long as we wrote it ourselves.
Oh, that is cool.
Yeah. Well, so it made for this great incentive. We were in a pretty nerdy class at the time. And so me and some of my friends would always try to race to see who could finish. It was supposed to be an hour-long test, and we'd see if we could finish it in 10 minutes or as quickly as we could. And so we had to pre-write all the formulas. How do you make the volume of the sphere? Or how do you find the other side of the triangle, or whatever it is? And so our teacher, intentionally or not, gave us a really strong incentive to learn how to program these things.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool, right? Because that's almost baked into the learning process that you're going to learn anyways, right? And the incentives almost line up. And it's not just cheating, right? Because even if you get the code, you learned, because it's only by learning that you can get that perfect code and finish the exam. Yeah, unfortunately, because we had the same calculators, but in all the exams I sat, there would be a round of teachers coming in and checking we didn't have anything on it and deleting anything we had. But I remember playing some like basic Mario games or Snake games on it. I was amazed with what could be done on these.
Completely. Yeah, those were the days.
All right. So that's so you always played around with tech. Tech was always part of your.
Yeah, when I was 11 or 12, I tried to invent emojis.
Okay.
Back way before emojis invented. This was back in the AIM instant messenger days. If you remember this, and there was a very limited set of smileys that you could use. And so as a over-eager 11-year-old or whatever it is, I tried to start this thing called P-smileys, personalized smileys, where you could design, upload, and download other people's packs and reuse everything that was available, and other fun, silly ideas. The internet was a great tool at a young age.
Yeah. It seems like there's the perfect narrative here. You were in the math class and you were already playing around with tech, and then you get into philosophy. Yeah.
And it's funny, actually, that same math teacher, we never thought about this at the time, but he was a PhD. He was teaching middle school math classes, but his PhD was actually in political science.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Who would have guessed? You go from that to teaching math. Yeah.
I mean that's the thing, right? Because if you try hard enough to connect the lines, the game theory in math and political philosophy and all of that kind of line up appropriately, and you can see the connections between the different things, right?
That's true.
So, and then now we come to your latest venture, right?
That's right.
And it's not called, it's Liquid Democracy, which I right?
Yeah, so this is a tiny bit of a confusing point. So Liquid Democracy is a name that was around before I ever came along. Liquid Democracy is the most commonly used name for this concept of peer-to-peer political representation.
Okay.
And so people have been talking about this in various forms. The big innovation in its current form was around 2002, I want to say, or 2003. This guy named Brian Ford wrote this paper called Delegative Democracy. That's another variation, another name for this model. But there are similar ideas going back hundreds of years. There's old Lewis Carroll books where he talks about these ideas, and there's this line from the Rights of Citizens and Man from the French Revolution where they says every citizen has a right to participate in creating the laws either themselves or through a representative, which really plugs into these ideas nicely going back 240 years.
Yeah.
But so the liquid democracy is sort of the abstract name for the concept in the same way that social networking or social media is the abstract name for the concept, whereas Facebook or Twitter are particular platforms that allow people to do that.
Okay.
And so the platform that we've created is called United.Vote.
Okay. All right. So if you could take it back, because so liquid democracy is the concept that you guys are applying through your platform. So if you could take it back, because I always like to think about social innovation projects based on problems and what problems they're solving. So if you could walk me through where democracy is right now, like how they got through it, because I've seen bits of this in your presentations where you talk about direct democracy and then representative democracy, and now this new form of democracy that you want to kind of try to implement. And if you could kind of hit the points where you think what's wrong with them, because I have some questions there which I think need clarification. I think going to the source is the best way of learning more about that.
Totally. Yeah. So the first point I want to make is that democracy is an ideal, and it's sort of more of an abstract concept, and it's continuing to evolve. And it's the goal of a democracy is how do we deal with problems collectively in a fair, collective way, or in a fair way that allows people to participate. And there are many issues that we want to deal with in our private lives, personally, one-off. But there are certain issues that we also want to deal with as a community. And when we need agreed upon collective action, that's what our democracies help us to achieve. And so there have been a number of different models throughout history for how to get this done. The simple story that I like to frame this in is, in the 4th century BC or the 3rd century BC in ancient Athens. We talk about this invention of democracy. And that was this model where everyone would come to the forum, to the agora, and could be side by side and talk about the issues, if they were allowed to participate. And there's a whole question of who's allowed, who's legally recognized or not. But everyone was in the same space together. And it is celebrated as a huge achievement in so many ways. It also has some downsides, like every model does. But it's got 2,000 years of history behind it.
Okay.
So I like to frame this as democracy 1.0.
Yeah.
Then we move to what we see today, the most common model around the world, what we typically call representative democracy. I like to reframe that not as representative democracy, but as electoral democracy.
Okay.
Simply because there are other ways to pick representatives, and that's what we'll get to. But the key is that we hold elections once every 2 years or 4 years or 6 years to pick a single authority to go to the legislature, far off, to travel from California to Washington, D.C., to represent the million people in our legislative district. Mm-hmm. And this model, there are some precursors of it back in ancient Rome and everything, but it really took its stride. We think of it in this, new constitutional republics, like 1776, 18th century model. And this was a time when there was no electricity, when you didn't have a telephone, you didn't have a telegraph. If you wanted to get a message from New York City to the capital in Philadelphia at the time, and then Washington, D.C., you have to write a note out by hand, give it to a guy on a horse. He rides for 4 days. Hopefully he makes it. Someone gets your message, writes a reply, takes another 4 days to get back. And that's, It's been over a week just to know if your message has even arrived yet. And so in this model, it's really important, and it's a big innovation at the time over the old direct democracy system where everyone could be in the same space together. We say, okay, we're all busy. We need to be tending to our own farms and all of that. And so we're going to have these representatives to speak on behalf of the people. This was a really important part of the founding of America. Remember, the rallying cry for America was no taxation without representation.
Yeah. So democracy 2.0 in this narrative was almost a reaction that direct democracy was great, but soon people were kind of like, I have my own things to do, right?
Well, so if we were going to get into the nuance of the historical story, there was the House of Lords and the House of Commons and the British Parliament before the American system. But you can sort of think of the electoral model as like a more agrarian or like almost industrial age model of democracy. It's really come alive in this industrial age. It's really taken over the world in this industrial age, where you have a few representatives go off to the legislature. But there's a number of things to notice about this model, in particular when it was being designed. In America, for example, the country only had 4 million people. It was growing quickly, but it was actually 2.5 million at the beginning, 4 million, 5 million or so. And so each representative was only speaking on behalf of 30,000 people. There was a big debate actually about this. Should it be 40,000 or 30,000? And George Washington himself said, no, 40,000 would be too much.
Okay.
People wouldn't feel like they actually know their representative and they can really trust them. It would get too, people would lose faith in their government. It's really important that we keep it down at 30,000.
So 30,000 was like that magic number.
That's what they thought. They actually wanted to write it into the Constitution. The very first American Congress passed a law to write this into the Constitution. And there's this crazy story about why it didn't take effect that we could get into. But suffice to say, it did not take effect. And today, 240 years later, we have on average 750,000 constituents per representative. So from 30,000 to 750,000.
Okay.
So that's I don't know, like 25 times or almost 30 times dilution.
Yeah.
And the lesson to be drawn from this, the lesson that I like to draw from this, is that our this model was a big innovation in 1776, but it hasn't necessarily kept up with the scale of our modern world. And as our world has changed so much, the population keeps doubling and doubling and doubling throughout the 20th century. And now we all have instant communication. Here we are talking across the ocean, and we're all plugged into 24-hour news when we can. And so the question to be asked is, if the goal is to create a process for everyone to feel like they can participate fairly and to be able to deal with our collective problems and issues and the things that we do want to deal with collectively as a whole, is there a more appropriate model for this modern information age that we're in with a much larger number of people? And I think the answer is obviously yes. There must be a better model, of course. And we see so many industries and so many activities and institutions have kept up with the times in so many ways. Here we are communicating over this video chat. And yet our governments and our democratic systems, which are incredibly important, which manage trillions of dollars every year in their budget, which makes decisions over who goes to jail and who doesn't, and who walks free and who receives vital health care and who doesn't, all these important things are still stuck in this really 200-year-old model. And there's a whole slew of reasons why that is. People are really protective of these institutions and are weary of wanting to make too rapid changes. But we believe, and a growing number of people in America and really around the world believe, that this new model that is referred to often as liquid democracy, where you have peer-to-peer representation, personal representation, ought to create a democratic process that people can identify with much stronger, can feel a lot more trust in, can be much more inclusive, can represent many more minority constituencies that are currently left out of the process, can be much more resistant to corruption. We can get into the whole thing about money in politics. And one of the issues that's really plaguing America right now, I would say almost fatally so, is this extreme polarization we find ourselves in. It's like, it's really, really bad. This, we're the good guys, they're all evil, red team versus blue team, Republican, Democrat piece that's going on. And that is, we could expect that to happen. And if you look at the historical record, there's always these two counterbalancing forces in the electoral system. And there's, because of the nature of the election, of the selection process of who gets political power, it's winner take all in America. If you get 51% of the vote, you take the entire seat. And even if you got 49% of the vote, you go home with nothing. And so that creates these really strong incentives for all the various factions to conglomerate into just two groups together. We talk about, like, in America, there's this saying that voting third party is wasting your vote.
Yeah.
And there is a sense to that.
So then you just choose the lesser evil, kind of.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people, there's a huge amount of dissatisfaction with the status quo. They take polling numbers on Congress all the time, and it hovers anywhere between 10 and 15 or 20% for the last 20 years. And they've done these polls recently about what are the most corrupt institutions in America, and the number one result has been political parties. And there's just a lot of disillusionment and a lot of dissatisfaction with the options that are being presented to people right now. Yeah. And so we believe that we can create much better, healthier, more trustworthy options so that we can live in a much healthier world.
Yeah, just to track back there, because my mind immediately when you said about this two-party system where it's red versus blue, I feel like this also translates to the individual level, because where people start seeing things as black and white, right? And where when people see one person on the red team, and it's kind of like there's no different nuances there anymore. You're on the red team, so you believe this, right? You're almost piled into one group.
Exactly.
Whereas it might be that on some things you are more left, whatever that means. Or on some other things you could be more right? But right now, because of the system, it's more, you just bracketed, right? Like on the highest level possible. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And truthfully, there are a number of rule changes we can make, system level changes to improve this.
Yeah.
And liquid democracy is not the only one by any means. There's a whole research, really fascinating research around voting reform and election reform about other voting methods. You know, right now we use something called plurality voting, or also called first past the post, where it's just whoever you get one vote and whoever gets the most votes gets into office. There are other methods. The most popular one is called instant runoff voting. And there are what I would consider even better methods like approval voting, where you can pick as many options as you want, and score voting, and this really cool system called star voting. And all of these you can model in simulations. And we've seen in other experiments that these don't lead to as polarized outcomes. These don't lead to extreme two-party outcomes.
Oh, okay.
And there are other things you can do. Like in Australia, you're required to vote. You get fined if you don't vote.
Yeah.
And so there's been some really interesting commentary on that it causes the candidates to be much more collaborative, or much more. There's less like mudslinging, because one of the ideas in American politics is that it's almost more effective to keep the other side's base from turning out than it is to actually garner votes for yourself. So that's really unfortunate. And so
it's more about focusing about making the other guy look really bad than saying, why choose me, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And there are all these other models would really weaken that strategy.
Yeah. So there are these multiple number of models, but you guys are kind of honing in on liquid democracy, right?
Well, I support all these models wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
And I have a number of friends working towards them, and I think they're fascinating and great stuff, and I love geeking out on them. The one piece that gives me pause, and why I personally find it most valuable to do the work that we're doing with liquid democracy, is that making any of these changes requires convincing the existing powers that be to pass a new law to change the structure, or to try to pass some sort of constitutional amendment or something to that effect. And it's really unlikely for people that got into power in the current system to voluntarily change the system that put them in place, and that they're currently benefiting from. And so there's just a conflict of interest in the strategy that is not all that promising. Whereas, and this is kind of a nice segue, we have this pretty unique strategy to make liquid democracy a reality in America, which allows us to approach it in a grassroots way that puts the decision directly in the hands of voters rather than in the hands of congressional leaders or legislative leaders.
Yeah, that's actually interesting, because that's one of the things that stood out about you guys when I did some research, is that because what now I know as liquid democracy and what you guys are doing, me and Matt and a couple of my other friends, we always talked about this, right? In your regular Tuesday philosophical talks, but it's always been, okay, how do you implement this, right? Like, how do you get this utopian idea and break it down to step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and get there, right? And I think that's where you guys are doing something really interesting.